The studio lights blazed down with an almost punishing heat that night, turning the sleek, modern set of The Andrew Brown Show into a pressure cooker of anticipation. Shadows sliced across the stage like knives, carving out a scene that felt less like a talk show and more like a gladiator's arena. The audience hummed with restless energy, their whispers a low, electric buzz beneath the thumping pulse of the show's intro music. Something extraordinary was about to happen, something so wild, so unimaginable that it would sear itself into the minds of everyone watching. And then he appeared, Barron Trump, all 67 of him, stepping into the spotlight for the very first time. At just 19 years old, the youngest son of Donald Trump wasn't just tall. He was a towering enigma, a young man who lived his life in the shadow of a global titan, now daring to carve his own path. His jaw was clenched tight, his steps slow and deliberate, radiating a quiet intensity that seemed to vibrate through the air. This wasn't just an interview. This was a moment that could redefine everything, and it was about to explode in ways no one could predict. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as Barron crossed the stage, his broad shoulders cutting an imposing figure against the bright lights. Andrew Brown, the host with a reputation for slicing through guests with his razor-sharp wit, leaned back in his chair, his polished grin flashing like a predator sizing up its prey. The audience clapped, but their cheers felt thin, fragile, laced with a question no one dared ask aloud. Why was Barron here? Was he stepping out to escape the colossal shadow of his father's legacy, a legacy drenched in gold, controversy, and unrelenting scrutiny? Or had he come to defend it, to shield the Trump name from yet another onslaught? The tension hung thick, a storm cloud ready to burst, and Andrew didn't waste a single second. He dove in with small talk that dripped with venom, snide remarks about Barron's towering height, his private life as a student at NYU, even a mocking jab at his mother Melania's accent. Each word was a needle, sharp and deliberate, designed to provoke. Barron nodded, his responses short, clipped, his blue eyes narrowing with every passing dig. The host's smirk widened, sensing a crack in the young man's armor, a weakness he could exploit. What was Barron hiding behind that stoic mask? Could he handle the blistering heat of the spotlight, or would he collapse under its weight like so many before him? The air in the studio grew heavier as Andrew leaned into his game, his voice smooth but cutting, a surgeon's scalpel wrapped in silk. He shifted gears, pivoting hard to the real target, Donald Trump. But this wasn't about policy or presidency. It was personal, vicious, a caricature painted with the broadest, cruelest strokes. Andrew conjured an image of the elder Trump as a gaudy, fast food-obsessed clown, a man drowning in gold furniture and tabloid headlines, a punchline too easy to resist. The audience tittered nervously, their laughter uneven, unsure whether to lean into the joke or brace for what might come next. Barron's face didn't flinch at first, but something shifted. His fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair, knuckles whitening as if he were physically holding himself back. Andrew, emboldened by the crowd's reaction, pressed harder. He didn't just mock Donald, he questioned Barron's entire existence, implying the young man was nothing more than a puppet, a spoiled kid coasting on a name that had long since lost its shine. "Isn't it true," Andrew prodded, his tone oily with condescension, "that you're just an extension of a circus act that's gone stale?" The words landed like a slap, and the crowd shifted in their seats, sensing the invisible line being crossed. Barron's silence stretched tight, a wire pulled to its breaking point, his gaze locking onto Andrew's with a cold, unblinking focus that made the host falter, just for a heartbeat. That flicker of doubt in Andrew's eyes was all it took. The energy in the room flipped, a sudden, seismic shift that no one could ignore. Barron leaned forward, his presence swelling until it seemed to fill every corner of the studio. The audience held its breath, caught between dread and fascination, their eyes darting between the towering young man and the host who dared to poke the bear. Andrew recovered quickly, flashing a practiced smile to mask his unease, but it was too late. The crucible had been lit and the flames were rising fast. He doubled down, his voice sharpening as he tore into Donald's business ventures, calling them overhyped failures propped up by empty bravado. Then he slid into even darker territory, mocking the elder Trump's bombastic speeches, his parenting, his very essence. The insinuation was clear. Barron was nothing but a byproduct of chaos, a kid raised in a gilded cage with no spine, no substance, no soul of his own. The crowd's laughter grew jagged, some chuckling nervously while others sat stone-faced, sensing the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Barron's jaw twitched, a tiny crack in his armor, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted in his seat, his frame somehow looming larger, as if drawing strength from the insults piling up around him. The stage was set for a collision, and the night was only just beginning. The studio pulsed with a raw, untamed energy as Andrew Brown leaned deeper into his attack, his words slicing through the air like shards of glass. The audience, once buzzing with curiosity, now sat on edge, their nervous laughter fatting into a tense, expectant silence. Barron Trump, the towering 19-year-old who'd stepped into this lion's den, wasn't just a guest anymore. He was a force, a coiled spring ready to snap. Andrew, oblivious or arrogant, didn't see it coming. He kept pushing, his voice dripping with mockery as he painted Donald Trump as a garish relic, a man whose empire was built on quicksand and whose son was doomed to inherit the rubble. "Come on, Barron," he sneered. "Don't you ever get tired of carrying that name? The legal battles, the headlines, aren't you ashamed?" The question hung heavy, a taunt meant to unravel the young man in front of millions. But instead of crumbling, Barron's restraint shattered, and what came next was a firestorm that would leave the studio in ashes. When Barron finally spoke, his voice cut through the room like a blade, low, deliberate, and deadly precise. He didn't shout, not yet, but every syllable carried a weight that silenced Andrew's rhythm, throwing the host off balance. He didn't rush to defend his father's honor with some rehearsed speech. Instead, he turned the tables with a calm defiance that hit harder than any outburst could. "Why are you so obsessed with tearing people down?" Barron asked, his gaze boring into Andrew with an intensity that made the host blink. The audience stirred, caught off guard by the shift, their heads swiveling between the two men. Andrew tried to recover, tossing out a barb about Donald's endless court dramas, but it was like throwing a pebble into a tsunami. Barron's response was immediate, unrelenting, and raw, a surge of fury that had been simmering for years, now boiling over in a way that stunned everyone watching. He stood up, his '67 frame casting a shadow that swallowed the set, and the power dynamic flipped in an instant. Andrew scrambled, his composure slipping as Barron towered over him, his voice growing louder, rougher, each word a hammer strike against the host's crumbling facade. "You think this is clever?" Barron snapped, his tone laced with a fury that felt unpolished, real, and utterly devastating. "Dragging my family through the mud for your ratings. Building your whole career on cheap shots because you've got nothing real to say." The audience gasped, some leaning forward, others shrinking back, their breaths held as the young man dismantled Andrew with a precision that belied his age. This wasn't just about defending Donald. It was personal, a release of pent-up frustration at a world that had judged Barron before he'd even had a chance to speak. Andrew tried to interject, his voice rising in a desperate bid to regain control, but Barron's momentum was a freight train, unstoppable, merciless. He accused the host of peddling venom dressed up as journalism, of thriving on petty jabs because he couldn't stand toe-to-toe with anyone who mattered. The crowd erupted, a chaotic mix of cheers and stunned silence, feeding off the electric chaos unfolding before them. Andrew's smirks vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace as he tossed out a weak joke to lighten the mood. It landed flat, drowned by Barron's unyielding presence, his voice now a rolling thunder that shook the studio walls. He didn't pace or flail. He didn't need to. His words alone were brutal, honed from years of watching his family dissected by vultures like Andrew, and he wielded them like a weapon, tearing into the host's credibility with surgical precision. The set felt like a battlefield, the air thick with the stench of humiliation as Barron stood over Andrew, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a fire that wasn't just about this moment. It was about something bigger, something deeper. He called the interview a sham, a rigged ambush masquerading as entertainment, and flipped Andrew's earlier taunts back on him, twisting them into a mirror that reflected the host's own desperation. Andrew's hands gripped the desk, his knuckles white as he tried to rally, accusing Barron of dodging the real questions. It was a flimsy counter, and Barron pounced, stepping closer until his shadow engulfed the set. "You're a fraud," he growled, his voice dropping to a guttural snarl that sent chills through the room. "A bottom feeder who can't survive without kicking people when they're down." The vulgarity came then, sharp, unfiltered insults that cut deeper than any of Andrew's rehearsed quips ever could. The audience was hooked, their loyalty shifting as Barron exposed the man behind the mic, peeling back the layers of swagger to reveal a hollow shell beneath. The studio lights seemed to flicker under the weight of Barron Trump's shadow as he loomed over Andrew Brown, his voice a relentless storm that drowned out everything else. The audience was a live wire now, their gasps and murmurs crackling through the air, fueling the tension that had turned the set into a smoldering wreck. Andrew shrank in his chair, his hands trembling as he clutched the desk, anchoring himself against the onslaught he'd unwittingly unleashed. Barron didn't let up. His words were a torrent of disdain, each one landing like a punch to the gut. He labeled Andrew a parasite, a washed-up clown who'd mistaken cruelty for cleverness, and the crowd roared, some shouting Barron's name, others jeering at the host, all of them riveted by the raw, unscripted spectacle unfolding before them. Andrew's eyes darted to the producers offstage, a silent plea for rescue, but the cameras kept rolling. This was live TV, and he was trapped in the wreckage of his own making. His usual swagger had evaporated, his face flushed with a mix of panic and humiliation as Barron leaned in closer, dissecting the host's career with a brutal clarity that left no room for escape. Every failed pilot, every canceled gig, every time you clawed your way back by stepping on someone else, Barron snarled, his voice rough with contempt. That's who you are, a guy who's got nothing unless he's tearing someone down. The insults grew cruder, more biting, each one a sledgehammer that shattered what little dignity Andrew had left. The audience couldn't look away, their phones already buzzing with clips of the meltdown, the night cementing itself as a legend before the credits could even roll. The host tried to muster a response, his voice cracking as he tossed out a weak deflection about Barron's temper, but it only poured fuel on the fire. Barron's gaze burned hotter, his towering figure a monument of resolve as he turned the final screw. "This show's a circus," he declared, his words slicing through the chaos like a guillotine. "A pathetic stage for a has-been who's got nothing left to offer. I came here to prove one thing, I'm not the puppet you think I am." The statement landed with a force that silenced the room, severing the last threads of Andrew's authority. The host's mouth opened, but no sound came out, his eyes flickering with a mix of panic and resignation as the reality sank in. He'd been outmatched, outmaneuvered, and publicly gutted by a 19-year-old who turned his own game against him. Barron didn't wait for a rebuttal. With a sharp, deliberate motion, he ripped off his mic, the cord snapping free with a crack that echoed through the set like a gunshot. The crowd surged to its feet, a wave of applause and cheers crashing over the stage as he strode toward the exit, his broad shoulders cutting through the chaos like a blade. Andrew sat frozen, a deer caught in the headlights of his own ruin, his hollow stare captured by the lingering cameras. Backstage, the producers scrambled, their voices a frantic hum, but it was too late. The narrative had flipped, and Barron had seized it with both hands. As he reached the edge of the set, he paused, glancing back not at Andrew but at the audience. For a split second, his face softened, a flicker of something human breaking through the fury, as if he understood the weight of what he'd just done. Then he was gone, disappearing into the wings, leaving the stage a smoldering ruin behind him. The applause thundered on, a visceral release that drowned out the show's theme music as it struggled to fade in. Andrew tried to croak out a closing line about spirited debate, but his voice was weak, swallowed by the noise of a crowd that had already moved on. The screen cut to black, the broadcast ending in chaos, but the message was unmistakable. Barron had won. Backstage, the crew buzzed with disbelief, replaying the moment he'd turned the tables, while Andrew remained slumped at the desk, the sting of humiliation etching deep lines into his face. He'd underestimated the quiet giant, mistaking silence for weakness, and paid a price he'd never forget. For Barron, it was more than a victory over one smug host. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. He stepped out of his father's shadow, not as a defender, but as a force of his own, unbowed, unbroken, and louder than ever. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.